Some of the names would include the Valley family, the Pratt family, that's Pratte. The Boyers are a big one. Some of their ancestors helped to settle what is now Old Mines, which is a community to the west of here, which ended up being inhabited by a lot of Missouri French families, especially after the Louisiana Purchase. Aubuchon is another big name that you see in the early documents, and several others. At times you see these families that are immediately traceable back to French Canada. Others, I believe, are more readily traceable down to lower Louisiana to New Orleans. But generally, the trend you see is families that came down from French Canada.
From the river to the valley to the sea, all the places, all the people that you can meet.
Welcome to the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. I'm Dean Klinkenberg, and I've been exploring the deep history and rich culture of the people and places along America's greatest river, the Mississippi, since 2007. Join me as I go deep into the characters and places along the river and occasionally wander into other stories from the Midwest and other rivers. Read the episode show notes and get more information on the Mississippi at MississippiValleyTraveler.com. Let's get going. Welcome to episode 69 of the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. Today we're boarding our time machine and we're going back to Old Sainte Genevieve. I'm going to talk with Jim Gass, who is Director of Research and Education at the Center for French Colonial Life in Sainte Genevieve, a historian by background. So we focus on telling the story of early Sainte Genevieve. After we cover his interest in history, how he got started in history himself, we talk about some of the what we know about the indigenous people who lived in the area before Europeans arrived. We talk about those early French settlers who arrived, who they were, where they came from, what crops they grew, what their day-to-day lives were like. We spend a little time talking about life under Spanish rule and who moved to Sainte Genevieve after the change in ownership of nearby lands. We talk a little bit about what you could do for fun in Old Sainte Genevieve, what some leisure activities might have been. And then we get into some of the things that the town is best known for today. We talk about the architecture, the architectural style that those early French settlers used to construct their buildings. Many of those buildings are still available to visit today, so we talk about the different players involved and who's managing what properties. If you're a visitor, where you should start, what kinds of sites you ought to put on your short list to visit, especially if you have limited time. And we just sort of wrap it up with a broader view of the work of the Center for Colonial Life. Sainte Genevieve is one of my favorite places to visit. It's a good spot to use as a base, especially if you're going to visit the area. They're known for their bed and breakfast inns. They have some nice places to eat. There's a lot to do in that immediate area. A lot of people go as a day trip, which is fine too. You can see most of the buildings in a day trip. But I think it's probably more rewarding to stick around for a couple of days, use Sainte Genevieve as your base, and go out and see some of the other sites within an hour or two. Well, thanks to those of you who continue to show me some love through Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can join that community, and you get early access to these podcasts as a result of your generosity. Plus, it makes me happy. So to join the Patreon community, go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg, and there you can decide what level you'd like to become a contributor at. Not your thing? Well, you can show me some love by buying me a coffee. I consume coffee every single day. I appreciate every little bit that helps me offset the cost of that wonderful habit. Want to know how to do that? Go to MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, and you'll find a link there where you can buy me a coffee. And at that same address, MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, you'll find a list of all 68 previous episodes. You can read the show notes and see the photos I post with the show notes for each of these episodes. MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast. And now, on with the interview.
Jim Gass currently serves as Director of Research and Education at the Center for French Colonial Life in Sainte Genevieve, Missouri. Jim has worked for the center for 5 years now, starting with an internship during graduate school in 2020. Jim holds an MA in Public History from the University of Missouri St. Louis and a BA in History from Illinois State University. His work at the center entails archival research as well as supervising interns and new hires. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dean.
Tell us a little bit about your interest in history. How did you become the go-to person for French colonial history in Sainte Genevieve?
Well, it really starts with museums, to tell you the truth. I mean, I spent a lot of time in them as a little kid. My grandparents took me to a lot of the same historic sites that you probably covered, Dean. Cahokia Mounds was always a favorite. Fort de Chartres was also a favorite. And that was mostly, before I was 10, but about the time that I wrapped up high school, I was interested in becoming a history teacher. That led me to Illinois State University, but I tended more towards research and language than anything else. Initially, I studied East Asian history. In fact, I still have a minor in East Asian Studies from Illinois State, but by the time I graduated, my focus shifted again, as it tends to do with a lot of us historians. It shifted pretty decisively to U.S. history, especially around the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and World War I. But after I graduated, I took a couple years off, spent a lot of time traveling with AmeriCorps, and then started my master's degree during the first year of COVID. They sent me here as an intern here to the Center for French Colonial Life, and as a result of doing a lot of the primary source research that the center has been kind enough to let me do, I've really absorbed a lot of the lore and the history of this place, and that's why I've continued to remain on here, is so as not to let a lot of that accumulation of the historical knowledge go to waste.
So how much did you know about Sainte Genevieve's history before you started as an intern?
Not much, to tell you the truth. I was vaguely aware that there was a town with that name to the south of St. Louis, and I was beginning to become familiar with the French history of the city of St. Louis specifically. I didn't know it at the time, but one of the authors that I was reading at the time also wrote the definitive book on Sainte Genevieve's history, Dr. Carl Eckberg. And gradually, I became aware of the site and thought, well, this is kind of interesting that they still have these buildings down here. And then Sainte Genevieve came up as one of the historic sites that UMSL, the University of Missouri St. Louis, partnered with for their internship program. And they asked me, would I like to come down here? It was a bit of a drive. But I was already at least passingly familiar with the site. So I said, sure, that sounds really interesting. And be a cool site to work for, and I've been here ever since August of 2020.
Awesome. It's a good place to be. There's a deep history to this town, and we're going to get into some of that as we get going a little bit. Let's dig a little deeper into that history too, and tell me, what do we really know about the people who lived here before the first Europeans came, about the indigenous folks who lived in this area?
The first nation that usually comes up in that discussion would be the Osage people, probably the biggest and most prevalent nation to live in what is now southern Missouri and northern Arkansas at the time that the first European settlers got here. They have a wealth of oral tradition that we lean on for a better understanding of what their lives were like and what their culture was like. As far as what I can tell you, they lived throughout the southern half of what is now Missouri for centuries prior to the arrival of Europeans, and they spoke Degia Siouan language, the southern Siouan language, meaning that their language is part of a group that includes the Lakota, the Crow, the Hidatsa, but is much closer to the languages of the Quapaw and the Omaha people. Osage tradition holds that they and other Degia peoples descend from the people who originally built the mounds in what is now Cahokia Heights, Illinois, which I figure most of your listeners are probably pretty well
I hope
aware of.
they better be.
Oh yeah, so considering it's a World Heritage Site and everything. No, the Osage were fully on this side of the Mississippi. However, by the time the first French settlements were built, the Cahokia Mounds civilization sort of peaks in population in the 1300s. I think is generally the range of years that is agreed upon. But the Osage were fully on this side of the river a few hundred years later, when the first French settlements were built. Worth noting, the Osage Nation very recently reacquired Sugarloaf Mound in St. Louis, which is the last of the mounds that still remains on that side of the river in the city. It was built by their ancestors somewhere between 600 and 1200 AD, and which speaks to how long they were in the area. I believe there are present plans to build a cultural center atop the mound, which is in the southern part of the city of
Right,
St.
you
Louis.
can catch a glimpse of it on Interstate 55 if you're going, if you're south of downtown. So that very timely news. It was just announced in the last week or so, I think, that they acquired all the properties associated with that. So that's really good. We destroyed all the rest of the mountains. So.
Right, and I was getting ready to say that is worth noting that the Missouri side of the river was, dotted with mounds of all different sizes and shapes for years. When Europeans were first landing here, but of course they were, gradually bulldozed with the land, spread back around, to clear fields for farming. The whole Mississippi River Valley, of course, is dotted with mounds from this era. But it's mentioned by a lot of the early French historians that the area directly around, like Monk's Mound in Cahokia Heights, was largely uninhabited at the time. There were some native nations still in the area, but very few lived in close proximity to Monk's Mound at the time that they arrived. The name Cahokia is the name of the nation that was living in the area at the time, but as for the original name of the people who built the mounds, that, as far as I know, is still lost to history.
Yeah, I don't think we know what they called themselves. Well, interesting. That's great. Let's move into the French history then. I think one of the things that surprises a lot of people, when they think about old communities along the Mississippi, they think about New Orleans, maybe Natchez. They think about the French presence at the southern end of the river. A lot of people don't think so much about the French presence here, but many of these communities were actually founded before there was a New Orleans or a Natchez. Tell us a little bit about some of the early French settlement in this part of the Mississippi and when people started building at what became Sainte Genevieve.
Well, Sainte Genevieve is on the young side compared to some of those communities you just mentioned. Like the earliest French explorer to pass through the area along the Mississippi was Jacques Marquette in the summer of 1673. His expedition got well to the south of the Ohio River where it intersects with the Mississippi, but they turned back around not long after there. Sainte Genevieve's exact year of founding has been debated, but it falls between 1735 and 1750. And its existence as a town was first documented 1750. There are definitely French speakers visiting the area as early as 1718, however, with the goal of harvesting salt from the Saline Creek, which is just a little to the south of here along Highway 61. The river at the time was fed by a salt spring, and it was it's a great geological feature to build your settlement next to. It has all that salt water that can then be boiled off for the solid stuff that can then be stored for long-term usage. However, the soil along the Mississippi was ideal for grain production, and that had caused people to settle on the other side of the river well before 1718. The French founded the village of Kaskaskia around 1703. Initially, it was mostly Kaskaskia native peoples and missionaries that lived there. The Kaskaskia had moved several times due to ongoing wars with the Iroquois, and they ended up settling and just a little bit to the south of where we're sitting now, just on the Illinois side of the river. And soon they were joined by a great number of French settlers, including relatives of a lot of the people who initially settled Sainte Genevieve just a few decades later. So there are maps, going back to as early as 1718 that show, a couple little buildings right by the Saline Creek on the Missouri side. but you start to see a village formerly referred to as Sainte Genevieve appear in the documents in the 1750s. So that's the date that we typically give people for when the town first gets its start.
Right, and my understanding too is a lot of those early French folks who came here were the missionaries. I don't, were they Jesuit? I forget what order.
Primarily, there are several orders involved in this at this time, like in the ministries to the native peoples, but the Jesuits are probably the biggest one. They, the black robes, as they were called. Jacques Gravier, I believe, is the main father who's responsible for a lot of the primary source documents that we have from the end of the 1600s for Kaskaskia specifically.
Right, because this is one of the things I always point to, hopefully correctly, but my understanding is that Cahokia, what's now Cahokia, Illinois, was really the first presence for missionaries, at least. At 1699, there was a Catholic mission that was established at Cahokia, which is a suburb of St. Louis today.
Right.
I don't know if it's been continuously inhabited since 1699, but it's an area. It's certainly an area with probably the oldest history along the Mississippi, from what I can tell.
That's accurate to the best of my knowledge, it fits in with the dates of earlier settlements. Peoria, Illinois, had a French presence there in the late 1600s. A lot of these villages do tend to move several times over. So in the case of Sainte Genevieve, the original village was a lot closer to the river. It was a couple miles from where we're standing right now. But it shifted over time due to repeat flooding by the Mississippi. And you see the same story play out elsewhere in the Mississippi River Valley. So it may be, a continuously occupied site. It's just that the center of the settlement will have moved, 2 or 3 miles over the course of its many, many years of existence.
That pesky river has a habit of overflowing its bank and getting people to reconsider where they were building their homes and farming. So tell us a little bit then about, regardless of the exact year, who were some of those first people who settled at what became Sainte Genevieve?
Most of them were of French Canadian descent. Most of them arrived down here by taking, the Mississippi, but sometimes also coming by other routes, like taking the Illinois, down from what is now the Portage of Chicago. Others came down the Wabash and then through the Ohio and then up the Mississippi from there to the Sainte Genevieve area. At least at one point, a good number of settlers from Vincennes, Indiana came over here, though that might be a little bit later than the time period that we're describing. Some of the names would include the Valley family, the Pratt family, that's Pratte. The Boyers are a big one. Some of their ancestors helped to settle what is now Old Mines, which is a community to the west of here, which ended up being inhabited by a lot of Missouri French families, especially after the Louisiana Purchase. Aubuchon is another big name that you see in the early documents, and several others. At times you see these families that are immediately traceable back to French Canada. Others, I believe, are more readily traceable down to lower Louisiana, to New Orleans. But generally, the trend you see is families that came down from French Canada.
So a lot of them probably would be able to trace their roots back to Montreal or Quebec City or places like that. And over time, the families moved west. And why here? What attracted them to this particular plot of land?
Well, it was the soil for one thing, just because the upside to the Mississippi flooding again and again is the ongoing deposit of silt and minerals in the soil that fronts on the river. Makes it ideal for grain production. Historians of Sainte Genevieve note that the people here didn't even really feel the need to practice crop rotation. It wouldn't seem that they mostly just continuously plowed the fields there and were rewarded for their efforts time and time again. That's one of the big draws. Lead is another big draw. There's a good amount of that in the hills to the west of town, which some Missouri communities still bear their names that have mine as part of them. But as far as what more broadly what drew people to this area, it was, I think, just the promise of a lot of open land and somewhat more hospitable climate than you would find down in Louisiana, or lower Louisiana, or up in Montreal, where the Missouri occupies kind of a nice middle ground between the two. Where we experience some very hot, humid summers, but the winters are fairly mild and not altogether bad to live as a wheat farmer in.
So was wheat the primary crop that they were growing then?
That is the single big one, yeah. There's a good amount of corn and tobacco grown down here as well. I couldn't give you a percentage for how much was for subsistence versus sale, but I can tell you that merchants from as far as like Philadelphia were exporting wheat to New Orleans in the 1790s. So it's, the few remaining French-speaking communities on this side of the river were not meeting all of New Orleans' grain needs, despite exporting a good amount of it every year. Now, in times of not famine, but in times where the floods had wiped out most of the crops, there would typically be a brief moratorium on shipping grain down to the city just to make sure people up here had plenty to eat. They also, I can tell you, had to generally ship the wheat down there intact as opposed to having it milled first, which leads to the spoilage, unfortunately, of some of the volume. But you do see periods in Sainte Genevieve's history where there wasn't a mill that was up and running that could keep up with the capacity of what was produced here in Sainte Gen at that time.
That's really interesting. So there was early on there was a strong trade relationship, a mercantile connection between this part of the river and New Orleans. So obviously, it's easier to imagine, loading up a boat with harvested wheat and shipping it downriver. At some point, the money or other trade goods then have to come back up in exchange.
That's where our central figure that we deal with here at the center, Louis Bolduc, really comes in. He's a much later settler to the area than a lot of his neighbors. Bolduc comes down from a little bit east of Quebec City as a young man in about 1760. But that is what he spends most of his life here doing, is shipping large amounts of grain along with other products down to New Orleans, and then bringing a lot of finished manufactured products back up here to sell to his neighbors. So he makes himself pretty wealthy as a wholesale merchant, for the next 40 years of his life, doing pretty good business here in Sainte Genevieve, which was apparently had a large enough market for import goods to keep him and at least a few other merchants pretty well supplied.
So during those 40 years then, was he basically kind of a distributor? Like he would collect wheat that everybody in the area grew that he would then bring down to New Orleans to sell and then bring back payment for that as well as things to sell? Or was he selling his own stuff? Or
we figure it varied by year to year because he was a sizable landowner. He owned several tracts of land down by the Mississippi. I've also heard, but haven't seen the documents, for tracts of land he owned closer to St. Louis. He co-owned a good-sized acreage to the north of here, close to what is now Bloomsdale at one point. We have the document for that. And so it would seem that during a lot of this time, there was a lot of grain being produced on his land, likely through slave labor. But it also seems that he probably bought and sold other people's grain too, given the opportunity, or if he felt that he could, that it could be sold successfully in New Orleans. Which, given just how much or how hungry they were for wheat down there, it seems that it was pretty likely that he would have a market for it.
so if you're living in Sainte Genevieve at that time and you're a farmer, you're maybe growing some wheat as a cash crop, what's your day-to-day life like? You must be growing, or you must be having other animals and crops that you're growing to feed your own family too. So sure. What's that look like?
If you're living in town at the time, if you're of modest means, like more modest means than Monsieur Bolduc, who we figure was probably in the top 5 wealthiest men in town for much of his life, you might own a lot in town that's maybe just shy of 200 by 200 feet. The unit of measurement is the arpent, which is about 192 feet usually. You might have a sizable yard behind the house where there's going to be vegetable gardens that are being tended, to produce produce, while your actual grain growing operation is going to be much further closer to the river, especially at a slight elevation decline, where the soil is a lot closer to the water's edge. Your land is part of a long, narrow strip that's maybe only about 200 feet wide, but it might extend for quite a distance running up to the river's edge. That's how they draw it on the on maps of farmland that are sketched from this time and for the next few decades. A lot of that land is going to be plowed by oxen, with iron plows. Some of those oxen, as well as other farm animals, will be fed on kind of a common area of the fields that are there for the use of people's animals that they're grazing. A good amount of the labor, depending on your level of relative wealth, a good amount of the labor might be provided by enslaved people during this time too. It was not uncommon to own at least one or two slaves of African descent that would often be working alongside you in the field, depending on the size of your estate. Of course, there are some who are having pretty much exclusively slaves tend their land. But one or two was a lot closer to the norm here, and as a result, a lot of this grain is being produced. Which, again, if there's a merchant who is interested, you could sell a lot of that to him, which he will then turn around in New Orleans or later on in St. Louis, where they badly need it during the first couple of years of that city's existence. But again, you also might be raising cattle on the side, livestock for slaughter to feed your own family. You'd likely hunt or fish whenever you get the chance to bring in extra food that way. You see, in some properties you don't see hardly any fish skeletons. In the archaeological digs, and other properties you see quite a few of them. So it does seem to have been varied from family to family. Just how much they took from the river as food goes.
Social class thing, maybe? Like if you were a poor person, were you maybe more dependent on fishing for subsistence than if you were richer, you had livestock or whatever? Or?
That seems to be pretty accurate. I mean, one or two farm animals seem within the reach of most people here, based on what I've read. But also, of course, we don't really get the voices of like the poorest people in town, recorded for us to read generations later. Most of the documents we have, most of the primary source documents we have are, business papers, wills and estate documents, land transactions, that sort of thing. And, those, even among the people concerned in those documents, they tell us fairly little about the day-to-day experiences of those people. But, we can figure, or we can get quite a bit from the existing literature on what their lives were like back in French Canada, and on documents and letters from Spanish and before that French officials in this area, who kind of relay some of these stories back to us secondhand, hundreds of years later, of course.
So I think this stat is about right. Wasn't it something like 40% of households in Sainte Genevieve in the 18th century at least one slave?
Yeah, I don't have the exact percentage in my notes, but to give you an idea, the largest slaveholder that I'm aware of during the colonial period would have been Jean-Baptiste Vallée towards the end of the colonial period, who had around 30 people enslaved on his various properties. So that was sort of where that figure topped out for the colonial period here in St.
All right. So then there was a major change across the river that impacted Sainte Genevieve's future at the end of the French and Indian War, right. 1770.
A little bit earlier than that.
1763
is when the Spaniards, 1762 is when the Spaniards technically take possession of this side of the river, of what we now call the Louisiana Territory. Of course, the war itself, I believe, ends in 63, but 62 is when the French and the Spaniards signed the treaty that transfers all of this over to Spain. And then that comes up in the negotiations for the end of the French and Indian War, where the British are not overly thrilled that the Spaniards are taking possession of everything west of the Mississippi, but they're getting everything to the east, and the French are gone. So that that is where the status quo ends up after the war ends. And it's in about 1768 that the Spaniards really move in and establish their presence as the governors of the Louisiana
And
Territory.
on the Illinois side, then, they became British subjects, and there were a number of people in some of those villages, Kaskaskia, for example, that didn't really want to be British subjects.
Correct.
So they moved over here, I think, right?
Good number from Cahokia, from Kaskaskia, from Vincennes. Probably a good number from further north than that, up in French Canada and some of the other, French towns around the Great Lakes. But yes, there's plenty of them that moved over to Sainte Genevieve specifically to continue to be under the rule of a Catholic monarch as opposed to a Protestant one.
Was there much change in day-to-day life for people under Spanish rule?
Generally, not really. The Spaniards tended to govern in what you might a relatively hands-off kind of way. They left a lot of administrative duties actually to Francois Vallée the First, who was one of the central figures of of the early years of Sainte Genevieve. They entrusted him with quite a lot. They actually rented a house from his family to serve as a barracks for the few Spanish soldiers that lived in the area. They were known for being the Spaniards were known for being kind of tight-fisted when it came to trade with the native peoples, much less open-handed than the French had been, and this generated some tension where there had been a little bit less, prior to their arrival. But really, especially in a community this remote, they were content to let most things continue on as they had for the previous few decades. They really focused more of their governing efforts on New Orleans and the immediate environment around there, because the port of New Orleans was really the most valuable part of the Louisiana Territory as they saw it. There are some minor changes, though. At the time of the American Revolution, for instance, Carlos III is on the throne of Spain. He's seen as kind of an Enlightenment monarch. He's trying, with some success, to sort of modernize the way the Spaniards governed the New World, to sort of cut through the layers of bureaucracy that had developed over the previous few centuries. One of the big reforms that we see at this time is referred to as coartación, is where an enslaved person in what is now Spanish Louisiana is able to demand that their master set a price on their freedom, and if then they can raise that amount of money, then they're able to buy their way out of bondage. Which was possible in many cases in these French-speaking communities where enslaved people typically took the day off after Mass and then just went and did more work, but for pay, for other folks in town. So you do see the possibility of freedom, appearing to some of these people, possibly for the first time. You also see a decrease in the enslavement of native peoples at this time throughout Spanish Louisiana. It was something I really read into when I first started working here, trying to kind of figure out if that was totally set in stone among the Spaniards. We know that the initial military governor of Louisiana, Alejandro O'Reilly, outlawed the enslavement of native peoples, or at least the trade in enslaved native peoples. But I believe a lot of scholars have looked and have not been able to find if the king finally ultimately signed off on that. So it carried some weight of the law, while O'Reilly was still still governor, but how well it was really enforced is kind of up for debate.
Interesting. There was a lot going on in that period of time, like government, changes in government, and the American Revolution happened. Do you know, is there much written about what folks thought about the American Revolution here on the Sainte Genevieve side of things?
Not much in terms of what they thought about the revolution as it was ongoing. The Spaniards, you're probably aware, were pretty sympathetic to the revolution and were happy to ship a lot of supplies up the river and then up the Ohio to be used by the Continental Army. There's a couple American merchants who were already very active in New Orleans at this time. But as far as what people felt about the revolution here in Sainte Genevieve, it's pretty unclear. Some of their cousins over in Cahokia and Kaskaskia were apparently pretty amicable, to George Rogers Clark when the opportunity arose to at least you know, somewhat oppose, the continued British rule of that side of the island and, or that side of the river.
Yeah, they practically laid out the welcome mats when he showed up with his troops.
So some of them were also happy to redeclare their allegiance to Britain once the British came back through. But you can't blame people, for being this far out on the frontier and seeing this disruption of their daily life as something that'll pass when it passes, and just trying to keep afloat until then. After the revolution begins is when relations with Spain start to take kind of a turn. You also see the Spaniards actively recruiting people, ostensibly American citizens, to sort of defect over to this side of the river to begin, filling up a lot of the territories here in Louisiana that the Spaniards were hoping to reinforce. They were offering pretty good rates on land. I think in some cases they were offering like free, land grants to people who would move over to this side of the river, who would take a loyalty oath to Spain, and at least nominally convert to Catholicism, though I think they dropped that requirement after a couple years. You may be familiar with the town of New Madrid, which is to the south of here. That was initially settled under Spanish authority, but it was primarily Americans who settled there. Right. And as a result, you get a lot of English-speaking peoples that are moving to this side of the river. Those folks, the French settlers of Sainte Genevieve, were not as big of fans. I can tell you that much. Depending on who you ask, some of them were model citizens, others were rabble-rousers. A change that I wanted to cite specifically is Henry Murray Brackenridge, who's one of the early chroniclers of the history of Louisiana at this time. He spends time in Sainte Genevieve as a very young boy to learn French and to kind of learn to navigate these settlements. He comes back as an adult and is dismayed, he says, to find that people are openly wearing weapons, through the streets in Sainte Genevieve, including like when they go to court. It's something that he noted as a marked change in the 20 or so years since he had spent his boyhood here. I think just the rapid increase in the size of the settlement and the development of the sort of frontier ethic that was being created at the time that involved somewhat of a readiness to violence that is associated with the early 1800s and the growth of towns along the frontier.
Lots of new people coming through, a lot of transient people coming through.
Right.
So yeah, probably created a sense of vulnerability if you were a person living here.
That's fair to say, I would think. And around that same time, too, especially after the Louisiana Purchase, when Brackenridge is writing from as an adult, you also see a good number of French speakers moving westward to old mines and to other communities that are further out from Sainte Genevieve. And I based on what I've read, I can't help but attribute that to the influx of American settlers, who again spoke a different language and were largely Protestant. And this would tend to, and as they were coming to outnumber the people here who spoke French, you would tend to see some of those French speakers move away to places that might still more consistently use their language as opposed to English.
Hey, Dean Klinkenberg here, interrupting myself. Just wanted to remind you that if you'd like to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that is set in places along the Mississippi. My newest book, The Wild Mississippi, goes deep into the world of Old Man River. Learn about the varied and complex ecosystem supported by the Mississippi, the plant and animal life that depends on them, and where you can go to experience it all. Find any of these wherever books are sold.
So if you're living here in the colonial period, what do you do for fun?
As far as the leisure time that they really had, we see a lot of card games that were becoming popular, across Europe at this time that are also becoming popular here. Faro is the big one that we demonstrate to people at the Living History House, which we keep open on Saturdays. That's sort of a banking game, similar to blackjack in some ways, but a lot of other card games are really becoming popular at this time. A lot of people are unaware the standard deck of 52 cards that we're used to today. That is something that comes to us from France. There are playing card sets of all different kinds throughout Europe, from about the 1500s on, but the one that we are most used to is specifically French. You see other games like Monte, like Euchre appear during this time. Gambling, while frowned upon, by some authorities, was something that was likely very popular. Billiards is something that we also know they played here in Sainte Genevieve. There are documents where the local priest was complaining of the amount of time that people spent in billiards halls, here in town in Sainte Genevieve in the 1790s. There's also a good number of, of seasonal holidays and feasts that people took part in. I know one of your other questions was about Gioni. That is a New Year's Eve festival that takes place every year. That sees sort of carolers, make their way from home to home on New Year's Eve, singing and dancing specific seasonal songs, with the hope of being rewarded with a bite to eat or a few drinks, either beers or spirits, with the idea that they continue to rove through town the whole thing gets merrier and merrier over.
Well, a lot of that food and drinks are better, right?
Yeah.
So this is a New Year's Eve tradition.
Still practiced around here. There's still an association that does that and buses people around from Prairie du Rocher to here and some of the other communities, and it's a good time. People get really into it consistently from year to year.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Maybe when we get to contemporary St. Gen a little bit too. So this wasn't Puritan New England, right? No. So there were places to play billiards, like you said. Drinking was fine. Sure. Generally speaking, there was not a frown. People didn't frown on drinking so much.
Yeah, it's something you see in the primary sources where there's a constant there's a constant tension between some of the religious authorities in the area who are appealing to the secular authorities to kind of curb some of the tendencies towards partying that you see throughout these communities, and just based on how it's an ongoing item of complaint, you get the sense that the secular authorities really weren't putting a stop to all of it, that it was sort of ongoing throughout the French period. I mean, that's something that the Jesuits were complaining about going back to the late 1600s for fear that the habits of some of these French settlers would be a bad influence on the native folks that they were trying to convert. Perhaps not without reason, given the proliferation of alcohol in some of those communities as a result of contact with French traders. But yeah, you're correct, and it is not Puritan New England by any means.
So what would it be like to step into a tavern then? Like, you would have people from across social class, maybe some travelers passing through. What would you drink? Would there be food? Like, what would the experience be like?
As far as the specifics on food or drink, the documentation is pretty sparse on that. We know that there were a couple stills and a couple breweries that were, in operation here as early as the 1790s. You actually see the valets, I believe, buy the rights to a couple of these from some of the early American settlers to make it to this side of the river. So beer and spirits were both available. As far as the food goes, I couldn't point to any specific recipe, and it is a great tragedy, but the documentation we have on early Sainte Genevieve is really, really light in terms of recipes, that would be characteristic of the region or of the town itself.
So do we even have a sense for what people might eat at home?
As far as what people ate at home, a lot of stews. Gumbo was big up here too, same as it was down in Louisiana. Wheat bread of all different consistencies and qualities was available here too. They sort of lived and died based around wheat. That was the single biggest thing that they produced here in town. So it was sort of the centerpiece of a lot of their diets. Usually a stew with several kind of game meats, some livestock, and a large hunk of bread to soak it up. That's something that you see in a lot of the histories of the area. Beyond that, there were things like persimmons and pawpaws and pecans that were available, for forage here that people did come to enjoy. And some in parts of Louisiana, not all of them, but in parts of Louisiana, people were coming to appreciate corn as well as something that they would grow and subsist on.
That took a while. They were wheat first people, right? So,
Yes, very much so.
All right. So let's talk about the buildings then. Sure. Tell us a little bit about their style of architecture, what they built, and how it was built.
So the styles of architecture used by the French colonists here fall into the categories of poteau sur sol or poteau en terre. Poteau en terre, post in earth, is probably the most basic form of this type of construction, probably goes back the furthest. Very simply put, you would simply make these vertical logs that would then be placed upright in a trench that was dug in the shape of a house, and the posts would sit directly in the earth. And then you would fill the spaces between those logs with a mix of mud and clay and straw. Bousillage was the term that the French used for it at the time, although the contemporary term in Normandy, France, is dolchi, spelled with a T. And this is probably the what you see most people in Sainte Genevieve have at this time. The posts themselves are very thick, sometimes up to a foot in width. They were built to last. And this is a style that goes back to Normandy, France, specifically. That's where not just a lot of the families here, but a lot of the families that settle French Canada more broadly draw their descent from. It makes for a very sturdy building in the long term. They tend to build the roofs very steep. They mostly build those roofs without nails as well. Like the beams that actually hold them together are pinned in place using mortise and tenon joints, and then heavy wooden spikes run through those joints to lock them in place. Makes them very sturdy in the long term, but also very flexible in the sense that they can sort of readjust as the ground settles out underneath them. And now, for wealthier folks in town, you would see the emergence of what we call poteau sur sol, which is post on sill. The same basic design, but instead of building directly on the ground, they would create an elevated sill made of dressed or undressed stone that you would then build on top of. The vertical logs would sit on that and thus be insulated from the moisture and the bacteria and whatnot in the ground. Enables the building of houses with materials like oak that are very sturdy but not exactly rot-proof, versus the cypress and the mulberry and the other rot-resistant timbers that they would be limited to for building a post-in-earth structure. What's more, the presence of those stone sills creates kind of a half basement underneath the house. I tend to call it a crawl space. Generally not that deep unless you built a really large sill to elevate the house very far off the ground, which is not outside the realm of possibility for a lot of these wealthier builders. What you also see in Sainte Genevieve and elsewhere, further to the south, is the emergence of the gallery, the wraparound covered porch that characterizes so many, or our image of buildings in French Louisiana and the French Caribbean. That was also present up here in Sainte Genevieve, because not just because of the influence of the Caribbean and Louisiana making its way up the river, but also because it tends to cool the house down substantially. It keeps the sun and the rain off, cuts down on light that's getting through the windows and heating up the building, and also gives you a comfortable place to potentially sleep at night if it's just too hot to bear inside the house.
Basically an extra room in a sense, right?
And at times they even built extra rooms on the porch. The Bolduc house has one example of this. It's something you see especially at the end of the 1790s, where they just walled off sections of the porch and called it good. You suddenly had a new utility room added to the building without having to redo the whole roof in the process.
So basically, would it be, if you're a person of regular means, not a rich person, it's one room? Like you build this house and you have one room that you kind of figure out ways to divide the space for your use?
One or two, yeah. Yeah, something that we hear about in some texts is that that the French crown and later the Spaniards taxed these properties based on the number of rooms that you saw. I haven't seen the documentation for that, so I'm not positive that that there's not more to it than that. But it would make sense given just how few rooms they tend to build to start with. You do see some people of means draw up plans for like a house with, say, 6 rooms, like in the case of Delassus, who was a French noble who fled here from the Revolution. But that's the only indication of a house of that size that I've seen. Others, even folks like Louis Bolduc, had 1 or 2 rooms, maximum 3, over the course of their lives.
So they built with posts vertically, and probably because that's the style they knew from their family, their cultural history.
Oh, yes.
Are there advantages or disadvantages to that building style compared to what was more common on the American frontier, where the post would be horizontal to the ground rather than vertical to it?
As far as disadvantages, the big one, that really jumps right out at you are these posts are incredibly heavy. They would be very labor intensive to build. They would have to be hauled a great distance and then hauled upright, which I'm sure is no easy task. The advantages include that the house would be incredibly sturdy as a result. The parts, like the beams themselves, could be replaced fairly easily with another log that you would pre-cut to fill in for it. Although a lot of the time, if there was an instance where there was rot or insect damage, they would just saw that piece off and find a new use for that particular log. The longevity of these structures, is pretty readily testified to, given that we still have 5 or 6 of them with the original walls, still here in town. In addition, the thickness of the walls, as well as other measures taken, probably made for a building that was much more livable during the wintertime up in French Canada and in the northwest of France. Of course, you see buildings that are somewhat more lightly built over time, as sawmills become more and more available, as sawn timber becomes more and more available. In addition, the way that they filled the spaces between the timbers with the bousillage material, all of that was very readily available, and it tended to pack very dense and act as a good insulator. But so you could easily fill the spaces between your walls to keep out a lot of the drafts, but then you could also readily replace it in the event that some of it started to rot.
So for the roofs, then, would they have tiling or something, or would they cover the roof with some other material? Or
A good number of roofs in town were still thatch well into the 1700s. Roof with shingles, like the Bolducs, that seems to have been kind of a mark of status or of relative wealth. And then up in Canada, at least, you see people who are the next step up from there have houses that are made of masonry. At this time, a lot of those buildings still stand out in Quebec City, I know. Down here, you don't see that as often. I couldn't point to a specific house from the late 1700s that still stands, that was made of stone. But as far as slate tiles on the roof, that's something you see more in Canada and would require you to have them shipped from pretty well outside of town if you wanted such a thing down here. I couldn't point to a surviving example that where the original slate roof would have lasted into the modern era.
right, that was probably more of a 19th century material, is more available. Yeah. Well, you talked a little bit about the river. Let's touch on that just a little bit more. Obviously, the river was important for trading. For a lot of people, that's how they came here initially, was probably by river. And then for some folks, there was some subsistence provided by fishing from the river. And then I guess you mentioned the way the properties were laid out. It's so common in French territories. You see this so clearly in maps of between Baton Rouge and New Orleans in particular, where everybody's got a little bit of frontage on the river and these really deep, long, narrow plots. And that was the case here too.
Oh, yes.
I guess for the same reason, so that everybody had river access in theory, or
Yeah, it seems to really have just been the French practice throughout the New World, because you see old maps of the St. Lawrence River where the lots take pretty much the same shape.
Right.
As for whether that was to guarantee river access, I couldn't really say, but at least we tend to think of them packing a lot of the most intensively farmed areas in to a central location, so that they're more easily monitored and possibly defended against attacks from, say hostile native folks or possibly the English, at different times, and that those practices would tend to hold over even during times of relative peace. It also made the community more centralized. You don't see as much of a trend with the French settlers as you would later see with American settlers, where their farms would be pretty far spread out, over throughout the frontier. Whereas the French settlements tend to be much more closely packed, where people are living in much closer proximity to each other, with relatively few people permanently settling out in the hinterland.
Right. So I guess I wanted to clarify that too, because as I understand it, then so you'd probably have a house in town, but the land that you farmed you'd have to travel to a little bit.
Yeah.
But then you would grow grains and the crops there. But then there were also common grounds for the city where most people would graze some of their livestock,
graze their livestock, and I believe collect firewood as well. But yes, yeah, that is. I believe there is one of those common areas delineated in one of the maps that we have of the riverfront at this time. Though that map. A lot of these maps tend to blur together in my head over time, but that one may be from the earliest years of after the Louisiana Purchase. But yeah, I believe it is labeled like the common field. But it is worth differentiating that from Le Grand Champ, the big field, which was the collective name for the individual lots that were all stacked next to each other at this time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. So 1785, we had a big flood.
Yes.
And so prior to that year, the actual town was a little further downriver where the town is.
Yeah, right about 2 or 3 miles is to the southeast of here, and yes, directly on the river. And nobody is totally sure of the layout or the exact location of any particular building within the old village, but the Army Corps of Engineers has done a little bit of scanning of the approximate spot, and found at least some archaeological evidence in the form of, I think, impacted lots where the old village would have been. But by now the river's changed course enough that most of it's underwater. But yeah, the 1785 flood it wasn't so catastrophic that it just changed everybody's perspective all at once. It was just the latest in a series of floods, and it was a particularly destructive one. I dug back through accounts of the flood the other day. I couldn't find evidence that anybody was killed, as a consequence of it, but it did destroy a good number of crops down there at Le Grand Champ, and encourage people to begin moving up in this direction, which is to the north and west. To settle a little bit further away from the river and at slightly higher ground. Some accounts say they moved at the suggestion of the Osage, too, that it was the Osage who told them that this would be a much more suitable location for a permanent settlement.
So did the river ever get high enough to flood up here, too? Or?
The closest it ever came, to the best of my knowledge, would be 1993. The Main Street that runs in front of the Bolduc House dips a little bit when you get towards the railroad bridge, and as far as I know, the river almost reached the top of that little hill there in 1993. So it didn't affect the Bolduc House, but it did affect a great number of houses that are only about 5 feet lower in terms of elevation. From what I understand, they called it Lake Sainte Genevieve for a little while because the river from pretty close by resembled more so a giant lake.
Right. It was kind of an epic battle to continually reinforce the levee to protect the town in 1993, and for the most part, it worked. All right. So at some point, Sainte Genevieve starts to lose its sort of exclusively French character. So tell us a little bit about that transition.
Well, the transition begins, formally after 1803, after the Louisiana Purchase. Like I said earlier, there were a decent number of Americans that had started to move over to this side of the river well before that. But with the Louisiana Purchase, with the opening of the territories to the west of the Mississippi, you see a much larger influx of people starting to move west here, and they don't necessarily remain in Sainte Genevieve forever. A lot of people just move through on their way to found other communities to the west of here. We have within a few miles we have communities with German names like Zell or Weingarten. And you do start to see, the relatively small French population overtaken by this larger population of Anglo-Americans as well as Germans that are starting to move to the area at the time. And the language is, maintained colloquially, by the old families for quite a while, but it is, it ceases to be the language of public affairs. Like prior to 1800, all the business documents were done in French originally. After, say, 1803, you start to see a number of them done in English, some of them translated into both languages, for the convenience of all parties involved. But then by the time of like the 1840s, pretty much all the documents I see, at least in the Sainte Genevieve collections that have been compiled, pretty much all of them are English language, and done more in a format that was suitable to the United States government as opposed to the Spaniards who had been governing up until that point in 1803. Yeah, the territory does retrocede back to France in 1800, but the Spaniards are the ones continuing to administer this territory on the ground all the way up until 1803.
So it's interesting that, basically like this transition away from exclusively French begins around 1803, 220 years ago. And here we are today in 2025, and you can still feel the French influence. There's still these cultural relics, French cultural relics in town. How they survived?
Tradition, is maintained, I think, by a lot of the descendants of the original families until, really recently, as late as the 1950s or 60s in a lot of cases. They say that even in St. Louis, as late as the 1930s, you could still hear people speaking to each other in Pawpaw French, if you happen by the right kitchen window at the right time. I've heard it lasted even longer in some families, further into the rural parts of southeast Missouri. As for what accounts for how those traditions are maintained since that time, I do really think it's the relative isolation, that a lot of people were able to live out their lives in, but over time, everybody comes to speak English as their primary language and to just find fewer and fewer uses for this older dialect that that is mostly spoken by the elderly that are still in the area. It's more interesting to us today because it is such a curiosity. It's something that in hindsight we all wish had been maintained on equal footing with English, to preserve sort of the region's identity going back to the French period. But unfortunately, you see that disappear in a lot of places. Lower Louisiana is the same, in much the same vein, but on a much larger scale, just given how many more speakers of French dialects that you see down there compared to up here.
When did the interest in building preservation in particular begin?
That really begins, I think, going back to at least the 30s. You see, if you go on the Library of Congress website, the Historic American Building Survey collections, some of the earliest photos in those collections are of Sainte Genevieve, of historic houses that were photographed down here. There are a number of scholars and museum professionals from St. Louis that gravitate towards Sainte Genevieve as a place that is worth studying for its architectural history. Some of those figures go on to assist with our parent organization, with the National Society of Colonial Dames, in preserving some of these buildings in the long term. The Dames provide the organization and fundraising necessary to buy and then restore the Bolduc House starting in about 1949. That lasts For about that process takes almost 10 years in terms of getting the house restored, but also getting the museum collections put together so that the house can open. And that starts right before the start of the 1960s. And that's really where I would place the dawn of interest in preserving these structures. That starts off a wave of historic preservation here in town that hasn't really ended, to tell you the truth. I mean, National Park Service moved in about 2017. As of now, they operate 4 structures here in town, and good on them for maintaining the structural integrity of these buildings, long enough for them to continually be updated and restored. We try to do the same thing with our resources, and yeah, it attracted numerous groups that are interested in historic preservation, and we all try to maintain a good working relationship with each other, sending guests in each other's directions to can hopefully continue to spread our various missions through word of mouth.
Right. So for people who come here today, some of these experiences may be relatively seamless, maybe not, I don't know. There's more than, obviously as you hinted, there's more than one player involved in preserving the buildings and offering tours of them. So can you just kind of give us an overview of who's doing what?
So our organization, the Center for French Colonial Life, which is an independent nonprofit, takes care of 4 buildings: the Bolduc House, the Bolduc Lamayeur House, the Linden Living History House, and hopefully opening by the next year, the Francois Valley 2 House. Then the National Park Service oversees the Jean-Baptiste Valley House, the Green Tree Tavern, and now the Amoreau House. And they are also maintaining, for the time being, the Delassus Kern House, which is down on St. Mary's Road, which is in pretty rough shape. And then the State Department of Natural Resources maintains the Felix Valley House, which is just around the corner from us. That's their only property here in town. And then a separate nonprofit, the Foundation for Restoration of Sainte Genevieve, manages the Guibord Valley House, which also goes back to the 1790s. And they also maintain their headquarters at the Kiel Schwendt House, which is a masonry building with a lot of German history, as well as their library that they maintain there. And there's other historic buildings in town, but they're all owned by private individuals. Some of them actively lived in, others not, or others are empty, but relatively well maintained by their private owners.
So if you want to, if somebody's coming into town and they want to tour some of the properties, like, what would you recommend as kind of, what are the must-see places that people should go? And you could start with the Center for French Colonial Life.
Yeah, I mean, I always recommend the Bolduc House, is really the first one to see, but also the Green Tree Tavern. The Bolduc House is not as old as the Green Tree. The Green Tree is older by about 3 years, is the general consensus. But the Bolduc House has, some of the most intact original parts still on it, probably as a result of the family continuing to live there through the end of the 1940s and maintaining a lot of the original structural elements all the way through then. I try to direct people to the Felix Valley House too, because if you take our tour, you see the Bolduc House, 1793, and the Bolduc Lamayeur House, 1820. If you go to the Felix Valley House, you're getting even more on the later development of the town through the perspective of Felix Valley, who's a grandson to the Valley family, and is one of these Creole descendants who really makes good on his family's connections and is able to find a pretty lucrative place in the new American order. But that's the state's story to tell there. I would let them explain better, the story of his life and the house that he inhabited.
And then, so those cover the houses. When people come here to the Center for Colonial Life, you have a museum here too. What do you showcase here?
We keep usually 2 exhibits in the building, on a rotating basis. At present, as of this recording in October 1st, 2025, we have our longer-running exhibit, Saving St. Louis, which deals with the Battle of Fort San Carlos in May of 1780. A lot of Sainte Genevieve militiamen took part in that battle in what is now downtown St. Louis. We are looking at replacing that exhibit within the next couple months with one that we've been working on for some time about Creole culture and what it means for this area as well as Lower Louisiana. And then our other exhibit is to shelter and sustain, and that's all about the architecture and the construction methods used here in town during the colonial period, including a lot of details on outbuildings and other structures that are lost to us today in addition to the surviving houses. And those are the two that we have currently. They get updated every 2 or 3 years, depending on what resources are available and like what we're able to research and write in that time. But it is worth, even if you visited before, it's worth checking out a couple additional times every few years or so. We continue to update this stuff periodically.
So then in terms of, I'm always a fan of trying to find some of the lesser visited or maybe less well-known places, and I may be a weirdo for this, but I like cemeteries. So the old cemetery just on Market Street, can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can tell you that a lot of the stones in there at least go back to the first couple decades of the 1800s, and some of them back further than that. It's been a long time since I took a walk through there, I'll admit, but there are headstones that had rubbings done of their surfaces back in the 1940s that were already old then. So it is worth checking out just to see if you can still discern what is carved into them, because time is not kind to these lime headstones, unfortunately. But yeah, a lot of those graves go back at least to the end of the colonial period. Lots of valets, lots of Pratts, lots of Boyers, and probably quite a few more names that I'm just not thinking of at the moment.
And then there are some festivals or annual events here that celebrate different aspects of, that have some French connection to them. Sure. You mentioned the New Year's Eve. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that will typically be open for a couple hours on that night. That's New Year's Eve. The organization that still transports a lot of the Guione crew. We have a good relationship with them. We see them every New Year's Eve, usually a little bit before midnight, where they are bussed from site to site, usually wearing a variety of period clothing and singing, the traditional French carols that are sung on that night, having been given quite a few drinks, at different points throughout the night, depending where they've stopped. It was a very merry occasion, 200 years ago. It still is today. Typically there's more than one organization involved in that. I'm a little bit less familiar with the actual administrative duties that go into that. That's La Guione.
And anybody's welcome to be part of that, or is it?
You'd have to contact the right folks to sign up for it, but yes, that's overall that's the impression I get. And then again, we typically open our site for a couple hours around the time that they show up, so people are able to come through and peruse the exhibits and wait for the carolers to arrive. That's New Year's Eve. There's also Jour de Fête, which translates to feast day. That's usually midway through August. That's typically the biggest draw for people from out of town. It also draws a lot of people who grew up in Sainte Genevieve back if they've moved outside the area. As far as specific French cultural practices that are on display there's nothing in particular that I can point to, but it is also the appointed date for Project Pioneer, which is done by a separate initiative here in town to honor at least one French family going back to the colonial period every year by sort of re-examining and republishing a lot of the genealogical records, requesting new photos or new narrative details from surviving family members. And that's worth checking out whenever they do that in early August. Those are the two big ones I can point to. As far as other festivals go, there's plenty without a specific historic focus. We have the Pecan Festival, Pecanapalooza, every fall, as well as Rural Heritage Day that usually falls a little bit earlier in the early autumn. But it is worth checking the town's website all the way from August to November, because they will usually have a lot of those dates laid out well in advance.
And what about the church? There are some burials in there, maybe, I kind of vaguely remember some connections to the French history too.
Francois Valley too is buried underneath that church. His house is the one that we're hoping to open by this coming year. He is one of the very few individuals that is honored in that way. He and I believe his young son, who died in infancy, are both buried underneath the church. You can see the stone marker for it next to the altar. That church itself only goes back to the early 20th century. However, the lot on which it sits was occupied by Sainte Genevieve's Catholic Church for many iterations prior to that. So his remains are still down there, to this day. But yeah, it's very worth visiting, regardless of your faith. It's a beautiful building, and it's as a result pretty representative of the faith and heritage of Sainte Genevieve as at one point a predominantly Catholic settlement.
Right. And it's free.
Yes.
There is that.
There is that.
Did I miss anything? Is there anything else you want to highlight about this the French connection here in Sainte Genevieve?
I want to elaborate just on the work of our organization. Originally, it really was just limited to maintaining the Bolduc House and conducting tours. It used to be the museum was just that property and a few people in period costume that would take you through the house, during the summers and early autumns. But since then, we have expanded to offering house tours year-round, every day out of the year, except usually Christmas. We also maintain the Bolduc La Meilleure House, which is a nice bookend to the colonial period, being built in 1820. On Saturdays during the warmer months, we open the Living History House, where we have a lot of reenactors hang out and explain their crafts to people. And then again, we're hoping to open the Francois Valley 2 house sometime next year, and that will be our 4th one. So as in addition to our main building, the center that we're currently sitting in, we offer quite a lot for just the one organization, and we are continuously expanding. Our historic mission has gone beyond just the preservation of one building and towards the overall preservation of the French culture and history that is available here. That's about all that I really wanted to point to there, just emphasizing our mission and our ongoing role here in town.
So if folks want to learn more about the center, what are the main places where they can go? I can post a link to the website in the show notes. Are there social media accounts where you post very much? Or?
We are active on Facebook, and that's really the other place to look for us. But other than that, the website is the first place that we would recommend checking out. We can also be reached at info@frenchcolonialamerica.org if you have any questions, or if you want to ask about putting together a group tour or a group visit. We offer discounts to groups above 30.
All right. Jim, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us on, Dean. We also appreciate it. We figure you got a lot of listeners who are very interested in the history of the Mississippi Valley, and we're happy to help add to that in any way we can.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the series on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss out on future episodes. I offer the podcast for free, but when you support the show with a few bucks through Patreon, you help keep the program going. Just go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. If you want to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that's set in places along the river. Find them wherever books are sold. The Mississippi Valley Traveler podcast is written and produced by me, Dean Klinkenberg. Original music by No Offense. See you next time.